All right, greetings and salutations to everyone. We're happy to have all of you here with us today on the festival of Shavuot. Today is the 7th week, 7 weeks of 7 days, plus 1 day of the Omer. Today is the 50th day of the Omer. Today is the festival of Shavuot, the festival of first fruits, the festival of the first harvest, later called by the Greeks Pentecost. Today is a very, very beautiful day, and today is a day that the Jews have long associated with the book of Ruth. It's traditionally read, the book of Ruth is traditionally read on the festival of Shavuot, and for good reason. The Feast of First Fruits represents that first harvest, the smaller harvest, but the first harvest. It's a festival that represents a harvest of grain. It's grain is a plural word, like elk. It can refer to one, but really grains is even more appropriate because it is the plural. It's grain. Where when we kept Pesach, right? That's a festival about the lamb, right? Each one would take the lamb for the household, but that was all a type of the Lamb of God, the Lamb. This is a harvest of the first fruits, and in its depth is not just for one, it's broad. So the Feast of First Fruits represents that first harvest. The story of Ruth takes place during the first harvest, during the early harvest of the first fruits. And again, the grains were being harvested, and that is the whole story of Ruth. Now, Ruth means friend. The name Ruth, it means friend. And she was a gentle, Gentile Moabitess. She was not an Israelite. Boaz, had part Canaanite blood in his lineage, and had Rahab, the harlot from Jericho, was his mother. In Matthew chapter 1, we'll go to the book of Matthew chapter 1. I'll just read briefly here. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. See, one of the most beautiful, precious things of the Feast of First Fruits that is being taught right off the bat here. Matthew 1 and verse 1 says, the book of the genealogy of Yeshua HaMashiach, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So then he gives the genealogy, okay? Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob. Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zahar and Tamar, and Perez begot, and it goes down, Ram begat Nahshon begat Solomon. Solomon begat Boaz by Rahab, verse 5. Solomon begat Boaz by Rahab. Rahab was the one that hid the spies when the 12 spies went in to spy out the land. She's the one who hid them and then let them out, risked her life to do so, let them out in a basket and a rope so that they could escape. So she was not a native Israelite, but she was grafted in. She certainly was grafted in. By faith, she chose Israel. By faith, she chose Yahweh as her God. So that is the story. In verse 5, Boaz then by Rahab, and Boaz then begat Obed by Ruth. Obed begat Jesse. Jesse begot David the king. So we have the story of Rahab, and now we also have the story of Ruth. Ruth was, again, a gentle Gentile Moabitess. So we have here in the lineage, the royal lineage of Yeshua, the king, the high priest, the king of David, the son of David. And in David's lineage himself, we have interwoven twice now the Gentile line. And this is very, very important. The Gentile line was woven into Israel. Israel was not woven into the Gentile. Now that is a very important thing for us to recognize, an important distinction. What is What does this have to do? Why? What is this this importance of David's royal line being woven together with the Gentiles? What is the importance of that? What is the symbolism? It says all these things happen to us for examples. We are to learn from them. And so we have in the Feast of First Fruits the story of Ruth and being tied in, showing this is symbolic of the Gentiles being tied in or grafted right in to Israel. And it's a very beautiful, beautiful thing indeed. Let's go over to the book of Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2. So because this shows that God is God not only of Israel, God is the God of the people, the Moabites. God is the God of Rahab and her people. God is the God of all peoples on the earth. All people on the earth. Torah is a gift not only to the house of Israel. Torah is a gift to all the people of the world, and they are to be grafted into Israel. This is a very fundamental truth, very important truth. It's absolutely opposite from the satanically foisted doctrine of replacement theology, which says the church has the Israel of God, the church is the house of God, and not Israel. Israel has been rejected and replaced by the church, and that is so false. Just the opposite is true. Nothing could be further from the truth, actually. Nothing could be further from the truth, because that is as opposite from truth as you can get, and that's about as far away from truth as you can be. The truth is, as God spells it out, that the Gentiles are grafted in, and that's his way of bringing salvation, and he's showing it right here in this feast. And again, in Ephesians chapter 2, the Apostle Shaul is teaching this to the Gentiles. In verse 7, Ephesians 2 and verse 7, it says, so that in the ages to come he, Messiah, would show the exceeding riches of his grace and his kindness toward us, toward all of us in Messiah Yeshua. For by grace we are saved. Then in verse 11 he goes on, therefore, Ephesians 2 verse 11, remember that you once Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, made in the flesh by hands, that at that time you were without Messiah, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. You were aliens to Israel. And this is what was being shown, that even in the very lineage of Messiah himself, he had the Gentiles woven in to show that he would be their king as well. Because that's the line that he became king from, that he would be their Messiah as well. He would be Messiah and king and priest, and his gifts of Torah are for them as well. Some think that the Torah is given only to the Jews. Friends, that is not true. That is something I've spent my life proving. I've spent my entire adult life teaching the statutes and the testimonies of God. And I've come to learn greatly from them and to love them and appreciate them. And I have seen and I have shown many, many times the Apostle Shaul, and indeed all of the apostles, teaching the statutes to the Gentile converts. It's in the book of Revelation. It's in every one of the epistles of Paul or Shaul. Every one of them are filled with teaching the statutes to the Gentiles and the holy days to the Gentiles. Torah is not just a gift to Israel. And this is one of the things that Shaul is making clear here in Ephesians 2 as well. Remember, you were once Gentiles in the flesh, and you were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. You were strangers to Israel. You were also strangers from the covenants, Israel's covenants of promise. You were strangers to them. They were not yours. Strangers from the covenants of promise, well, what's the result? Having no hope, without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, You who once were far off have been made near by the blood of Messiah, for he himself is our shalom, who has made both one. The Jew and the non-Jew are made one through Messiah. He has broken down the middle wall of division between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity that is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace between the Jew and the Gentile, so that he might reconcile them both, the Jew and the non-Jew, to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. He preached peace to you who once were far off, and to those who were near. He preached peace to all people. Right? Isn't that what it says? Isn't that the good news? A light has shined, goodwill toward men. When Messiah was born, it was good news for the whole world. For through him we both, verse 18, have access by one Spirit to the Father. Therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners to Israel, you Gentiles. You are no longer strangers and foreigners to Israel. This is the story of Ruth. This is the teaching of the Apostle Shaul as well. You're no longer foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, that is, with Israel, with the household of God, having been built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with the Yeshua Messiah himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building is built. Again, in Romans chapter 11, Paul makes it abundantly clear to the church at Rome, just like he did to the church at Ephesus. Let's go now to Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, and I'll just read a couple of verses here. In verse 16, he says, if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them became partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. So some of the branches were broken off, not all of them, just some. Some of the branches were broken off. If you break all of the branches off of a tree, a lot of times you will kill the tree. Some of the branches were removed, not all of them. And you being a wild olive tree, he's saying to the Gentiles, you are grafted in to the tree that is Israel. In and among them, not two trees. Not one tree for the Gentiles and one for the Jews. The Gentiles were grafted into the tree that is Israel to be among them and, as he says, with them, and became partaker of the root and fatness of the natural olive tree. So do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, remember, you do not support the root, but the root does support you. Israel does support the Gentile church. Indeed, Israel has done a lot of work to preserve and to keep the scriptures, and they have suffered the persecution as being the firstborn, those who were called to bear. They have a greater burden to bear, in that they were given extra ordinances to follow and to keep, which are incredibly important to teach us types, the sacrificial system to point us to Messiah, and the clean and the unclean to show us the difference between the clean and the unclean and the holy and the unholy. And God in his mercy decided that he wasn't going to make every single man and woman follow those, but he gave the extra burden to the house of Israel. He gave the extra burden to the Jews to bear. And they have been bearing it and have been persecuted. And they were also told, just like Messiah was rejected and hated and despised and not accepted, and died before he would be glorified. So the Jews had to be hated, and they had to be despised, and they had to be rejected, and they had to die before finally they will be raised and glorified. They have to follow the path that their Messiah followed, and they bore that in part for you, for the Gentiles. So there should be gratitude That is what you're grafted into. Being a first fruit is not easy. So, I want to impress that to those who have ears to hear, for it is the truth. Okay, continuing. I like to wear my tallit on the high days. It is a high day today. So here we have in the lineage the Gentiles being woven in, just like the Apostle Paul is explaining that they're grafted into the tree that is Israel. And so we see this teaching again on the Feast of First Fruits. It's very, very beautiful, and it's very precious because, hey, you know what? There's a lot of people in the world, and of all the people in the world, there are only a few who are the first fruits, right? I mean, you look at the grains in a harvest and how much comes in the main harvest as compared to the first harvest. The first harvest is very small by comparison. If you are hearing this message and you are interested in it, that means you are either a first fruit or you have an opportunity to be a first fruit. How much does that mean to you? I read about the account of a man who despised his birthright. And he lost it. Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23 gives us an account of each of the high days. It begins with Shabbat. It begins to teach us about Pesach, the festival of Matzah. Then in verse 9, Leviticus 23 and verse 9, the Eternal spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give to you, and you reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf." The word sheaf in the English there is translated from the Hebrew, omer. This is where we get the counting of the omer. It's approximately 2 liters. So sometimes we think a sheaf, we think like a bushel of grain or something. You know. Try not to think in English when you study God's Word. Try to think in Hebrew. It's the omer. And that means about 2 liters of grain. Not something that was still on the stalk, but it was harvested grain. You would bring an omer of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. This was not something that the priest was cutting. It was not just a ceremonial thing. It was from the first fruits of a harvest. A harvest. Now, I know some will say, oh, the priest would not cut it. That's not true. I'm reading from Torah. This is what Torah says. The children of Israel, it says, were to harvest it, not the priests. The children of Israel, when they came into the land and they would reap a harvest, then they would bring an omer of the first fruits and give it to the priest from the people. And he would wave the sheaf or the omer of grain before the Eternal to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after Shabbat, that word Shabbat is the same word as in verse 32. It's the same word as in verse 39. It's referring to the high days. On the morrow of Shabbat is on the morrow of the first day of unleavened bread, which was a Shabbat. And so it meant from the second day of unleavened bread, they would wave it. I literally have written a whole entire book on that subject. Well, heavily on that subject anyway. Covers obviously many other things. But so I don't want to recover that material. But they would wave it. And when you offer it that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year without blemish as a burnt offering to the Eternal, its grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made by fire to the Eternal for a sweet aroma. Its drink offering would be of wine, 1/4 of a hin, 1/4. You shall eat neither bread nor parched grain nor fresh grain until The same day that you have brought an offering to your God, it will be a statute forever throughout your generations. So they had to bring an offering of the first fruits before they were allowed to eat of the harvest. And this is an important principle. God is always first. He's always the preeminent one. So we always tithe before we eat. We always give an offering for something before we eat of it. That is God's way, and this is, again, spelled out as something for the feast of first fruits. And you shall count, you shall scribe, is the word. You shall scribe, you shall store, you shall recall, as the word. You shall recount, as the word. It doesn't mean 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. It means day 1 we did this, day 2 we did that, and on day 3 we did this. And I remember on day 4, and this is what Israel did on day 21, and this is what Israel did on day 27, and this is where I'm at in day 27. And you recall or remember, you remind yourself of your journey as you come out of Egypt, and you contemplate what Israel went through as they came out of Egypt, and you recall it, and you scribe it to remember in that way. You shall recall for yourselves day by day until you get to 50. You shall number or remember for yourselves from the day after Shabbat, the day after that you brought the sheaf of the wine offering, 7 weeks shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th week. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Eternal. You shall not bring from your habitations, you shall bring from your habitations 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the firstfruits to the Eternal. They are to be baked with leaven. These offerings were offered, they were baked with leavening. So that shows that this, normally the offering for the matzah was unleavened during the Feast of Matzah, but this one had leavening added. And I believe this leavening symbolizes 2 things. We know the leavening symbolizes sin. We all understand that. And so this shows that this is an offering. Pesach was an offering of the Lamb. It was sinless. Messiah has no sin. But we do have sin. And so this is offered with leavening, showing, I think, maybe that we have some sin in our lives. But much more than that, Israel was purified through the sacrificial system. They were atoned, right? They came under the blood of the Lamb. So although they had sinned, although we sinned, we are innocent before God because of the blood of Yeshua. So the Gentiles, I think this is symbolic of the Gentiles. That's why the leavening is added, because the Gentiles were also being offered to God in this sense, in this way. And that's the symbolism of the leavening, because the Gentiles were also being offered, not just the Israelites. And I'll show you, this has been a belief among the house of Israel since ancient days. I'll just read briefly from the works of Philo, Philo was alive during the days of the Apostle Shaul. He was a historian in Jerusalem at temple time. So I'm just going to read from Philo under the special laws, chapter 29, section 162, under the heading, the Sixth Festival. And I will just read this here briefly for you. This was their thought 2,000 years ago during the days of the apostles. This was their belief. There is also, he goes, quote, there is also a festival on the day of the Paschal Feast, Passover, which succeeds the first day and is named the sheaf. In other words, succeeds or follows the first day of unleavened bread, so that'd be now, if it follows the first day, it's on the second day of unleavened bread, and it's the day of the wave sheaf offering, from which takes place on it. For the sheaf is brought to the altar, the first fruit of both the country which the nation has received on its own, and also for the whole land, so as to be an offering both for the nation separately, and also a common offering for the whole race of mankind, so that the people by it worship the living God, both for themselves and for all the rest of mankind. He goes on, and I thought I would just share that with you from the works of Philo. Okay, so let's go back now. I'll continue here in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 16. Deuteronomy chapter 16, and beginning in verse 8. Deuteronomy 16:8. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a sacred assembly to the eternal your God. You shall do no work on it. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Then you shall keep the feast of weeks to the eternal your God, with a tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the eternal your God blesses you, and you would rejoice before the eternal your God. You and your son and your daughter and your manservant, your maidservant, the Levite who is within your gates, and the stranger and the fatherless, and the widow who are among you, at the place the eternal your God chooses to make his name abide. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes always. They are precious. Now, Pentecost was a time when the ears of the Gentiles began to be opened. And that's very important to understand. It's a time when the Gentiles began to listen. We go to Acts chapter 2, Pentecost, the Feast of First Fruits. Acts chapter 2. Acts 2 and verse 1. It says, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began to speak with other tongues or other languages as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem, there were Jews, there were devout men, look what it says, verse 5. From every nation under heaven, devout men with the Jews. So there were Jews and non-Jews. The Gentiles began to listen. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together. And they were confused, and they began because everyone heard them speaking in his own language. They were all amazed, and they marveled, saying to one another, look, not all of these who speak are Galileans. How is it then that we each hear in our own language in which we were born? Parthians, Medes, Medes like the Medes and the Greco-Macedonian Empire. We read about the empires in the book of Daniel that rose here. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Egypt, parts of Libya, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, it says. Cretans and Arabs also. We hear them speaking in our own tongues the wonderful works of God. Look, the Gentiles began to listen on Shavuot. It's symbolic. God was opening the way, and he was showing through the lineage of David, the lineage of Messiah, and the Apostle Shaul is really fleshed that out for them more in the book of Romans chapter 11 especially, but also in chapter 3, chapter 9, other places, Ephesians 2, and in other places. So I want to share this with you. It is the appropriate time. So now let's examine the book that is today read by thousands and thousands of synagogues all over the world and see how it ties in with the festival of Shavuot. Let's go to Ruth and begin to read the book of Ruth together. Ruth. Joshua judges Ruth. He doesn't really, but that's just the way the books fall. And I will sneak a drink. Okay, Ruth, chapter 1. It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, meaning the house of bread, Judea, he went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. It means sweet, lovely. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They went to the country of Moab. They remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there for about 10 years. And then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman survived and her 2 sons and her husband. So interesting. It's a sad story. I mean, Ruth had a hard life. Naomi had a hard life. It reminds me of my mother. My mother's name was Naomi, sweet woman. Naomi was a beautiful woman, and her husband died. And then she lost 2 sons very, very shortly thereafter. It's interesting how much she paralleled this beginning of the book of Ruth here in her own life. So I can really feel for this. Verse 6, then there arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Eternal had visited his people in giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go now, return each to her mother's house. And go back, your daughters of Moab, go back to your mothers, live with your mothers in Moab, take a husband in Moab, go return. The Eternal deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead, and as you have dealt with me. And the Eternal grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. And go get remarried and find shalom in your marriage in the house of your husband. And she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. You see, they were not their people. It was your people, Naomi. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, no, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have any hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, then would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Eternal has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and they cried. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. In other words, she kissed her goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister has gone back to her people and to her gods, to her way of life, to her own people, back among the Gentiles to live as a Gentile. Return after your sister. But Ruth said, do not entreat me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Don't do that anymore. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, that's where I will lodge. And your people shall be my people. Now, friends, if you believe that you're a Christian, then the truth is, if you believe you're the Apostle Paul is God's apostle, then the truth is you are grafted in to the house of Israel. You are grafted in to Israel. Not into a Gentile church, not into to love Jesus among a bunch of other people who love Jesus apart and separate from the Jews and apart and separate from Judaism. That is a fallacy. We are called to love Jesus. I love Jesus. Yeshua is his name. Jesus was adopted about 500 to 600 years ago at the behest of the Catholic Church. It's actually a nickname. It's not actually his name at all. It's not a translation. And that's okay. We say Jesus because, that's what people are used to, and it connects with people. But his name was Yeshua. His nickname is Jesus. It's not a translation. At any rate, to think that all you have to do is love Jesus and Jesus loves you, and you can just continue on and you're in your congregation of people who love Jesus, separate and apart from Judaism, separate and apart from Jews, separate and apart from the house of Israel, that is a fallacy. That is a Gentile Jesus. This is not what the Scripture teaches. That is a Gentile religion. It is not what the Bible teaches. If we want to be true to the truth, then that's one of the meanings of Shavuot, that it teaches us. We are grafted in. All who are not part of the house of Israel are grafted in. And this is the story of Ruth. So this is what Ruth said. Your people shall be my people. And so those of you who do not consider yourself Jews, I just ask you to consider, do you consider the Jews to be your people? If you do not, then you have not yet attained the level of conversion that Ruth had. You've not yet attained the level of understanding that Ruth had. You have not yet attained the level of calling and wisdom that Ruth had. You have not yet attained the level that the Apostle Shaul said you are grafted in to be. That Messiah's blood was for the purpose of tearing down the wall of division. And the wall, you know where it exists? It goes from the east to the west. It goes from this ear to this one. The wall is inside our minds. It reveals itself through a lack of understanding. It reveals itself through anti-Semitism. It has many ways of revealing itself. The wall needs to be torn down. Your people will be my people, that we may all be one as we follow the eternal together. Your people will be my people. I will be grafted in, and I will worship God, and I will practice biblical Judaism, not rabbinical Judaism, along with Boaz. I will serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what she said. Your people will be my people. I will be counted as an Israelite. I do not want to be counted as a Moabitist anymore. I do not want to be counted as an Indian anymore. I do not want to be counted as a German anymore. I do not want to be counted as a Greek anymore. I want to be counted as your people, part of the house of God, grafted in. That's what Ruth said. Your people will be my people. Doesn't mean we have to turn against anyone. Just means we turn toward God and we turn toward Israel. Not to worship Israel, but to worship God with Israel. Wow. She said, your people will be my people. Continuing, she said, your God will be my God. Whose God? The God of the house of Israel. Where you die, I will die, and that's where I'll be buried. The eternal do so and more to me also, if anything except death parts me from you. When she saw that she was determined, she stopped speaking to her about leaving. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, well, why would you call me Naomi, which means sweet? Instead, you should call me Mara. Remember Mara when they were traveling during the Omer, the counting of the Omer? One of the things they came up to is the waters that were bitter. And they were called Mara. I think it was Exodus like 17 or 18, something like that. 17, I think. Anyway, Mara, which means bitter. So she said, don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. Call me Mara. Because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Eternal has brought me home again empty. So why would you call me Naomi, since the Eternal has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So she was hurt, and she was still suffering. And Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, returned from the country of Moab, and came to the house of bread, to the city called Bethlehem, which means house of bread, at the beginning of the barley harvest, which was the early harvest. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And so Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Then she left. And she went and she gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Eternal be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. And Boaz said to his servants, who was in charge of the reapers, he said, well, whose young woman is this? And so the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, well, it's the young Moabite woman who came with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So that she came and has continued from the morning until now, though she did rest a little while in the house. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Will you listen to me? Don't go glean in another field. Don't go from here. Stay close by my young women, and let your eyes be on the field that they reap from, and go after them. In other words, it was a custom, it was a practice in the house of Israel because of the statutes of God to follow along in the back and follow along the gleaners, and they would leave something behind. And so they left it behind for the poor on purpose. So he's instructing them, stay in the field where you see my servants working. Verse 9, let your eyes be on the field that they reap from, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go into the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, and she bowed down to the ground, and she said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you would take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? You're treating me so kindly, you're not treating me like a foreigner. You're treating me like one of your own family. And Boaz answered and said to her, it's been fully reported to me that what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father, and you have left your mother, and you have left the land of your birth, and you have come to a people whom you didn't know before. The Eternal repay your work with a full reward. May a full reward be given to you by the Eternal, Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Ah, beautiful. The wings. You know, the wings refers to, well, here's a wing. Say I got this little tallit on here, and this is a corner of a garment. The corner of my garment is called the wing, and that's the way it came out. Like the wings, that's what they thought of them as. The wings would come forward, and these wings have in them tzitzit, which in Numbers 15, God commands us to wear the tzitzit in the corners or in the wings of the garment and put a blue thread. And there's symbolism behind the tzitzit is incredibly important. This is important for you Gentiles as well, because this is what you're grafted into, remember. Okay? So, in the wing is the tzitzit, which is, God says we are to remember him by. Again, you can read about it in Numbers chapter 15. And put the blue thread, and blue like the color of the sky, where God's presence is. It's also the color of royalty that the priests would wore this color, but also the blue representing water, the color of water, and Shavuot, Pentecost, the water, the Holy Spirit, baptism, etc. So much more than that, much more than that. It was a symbolism of wedding. It was a symbolism of an engagement. To come under the skirt of another was to take them as your wife. And that's what we're seeing here. And that's what I will share with you as we go on. So she came under the wings of God because the Eternal himself has in the corners of his garment the tzitzit. The Eternal himself wears the tzitzit. Yeshua wore the tzitzits everywhere he went, and they reached out to try to touch the tzitzit, the corner of his garment, the wings of his garment. And then as many as touched it were made well. They were healed because there are healing in his wings. Remember the promise of Messiah in Malachi 4? The Messiah will come with healing in his wings. So those that knew Yeshua was Messiah, Jesus was the Messiah, those who knew that when he came, they reached out to touch his wings because they knew what the prophet Malachi said. And they knew that if he is Messiah, well, then there's going to be healing in his wings. There are going to be healings in the corners of his garment. And they reached out and they grabbed the tzitzit. And as many as touched it were made well because there was healing in his wings. But much more than that, his wings also are symbolic of our marriage to him. Oh, wow. It's beautiful. It's awesome, and it's deep, and it is so rich. She came under the wings of God. And that's what he mentioned to her. Okay, where was I before I got myself too sidetracked? What verse did I finish in? I'll find it here. If somebody sees it, holler it out for me. Save me a minute. Where did I stop? Okay, in verse 12 I finished. Verse 13, then she said, let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and you have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. And Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and as he passed parched grain to her, and she ate, and she was satisfied, and she kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. In other words, when she's picking up things, even if she comes to your stacked grain where you've been bringing it in from the field and throwing it in the stack, bringing it in the field and throw it in the stack, and if she comes and picks up some of that out of the stack, don't say anything to her. Don't correct her for it. She can have whatever she wants. That's what he told her. In John chapter 6, going forward to the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, New Covenant Scriptures, John chapter 6 and verse 43. Yeshua answered and said to them, do not marvel among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And I will raise him up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father, except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. These types here are absolutely beautiful. You see what Ruth was being called in the smaller spring harvest. No one can do what Ruth did. Nobody can do what we are doing today unless they are called to Yeshua the Messiah. And to be part of this first harvest is an absolutely precious, precious thing. God was calling Ruth. It was through the lovely example of Naomi that Ruth was called. You know, that's something for us to ponder. What brought Ruth to the point where Ruth would say, your God is my God? What brought Ruth to the point where Ruth would say, your people are my people? You know, I I like your people. Man, if your people are anything like you, I want to know them. What brought Ruth to the point that she would say to Naomi, I want to be part of Israel. I want to worship the God of Israel, the only true God. What brought her to that point? Was it her sternness towards Torah? Was it the sternness with which she taught the statutes or followed them and every little thing had to be just right? Or was it love? Was it love? You see, Naomi set an incredibly beautiful example for Ruth. And that attracted Ruth. And we as Jews are called by God to share the way of God with the world, are we not? We understand that. We are called to live a beautiful life, one of love and truth and humility, so that when the Gentiles see it, they will say, I want to be a part of that. Looking down on a Gentile does not entreat them to want to follow you and follow God with you or worship God with you. It just doesn't. Being humble and loving and kind like Naomi was, well, that's one of the things this feast teaches us. And that's a very important thing to remember. What kind of an example are we setting? Are we setting an example that draws others, whether you're a Jew or not? Are you setting an example that draws others to say, I want to worship God with you? I'd like to worship God with you. Are we setting that example to people? Do we make them feel welcome? That's an important part of the lesson of this day. Do we draw other people or repel them? Arguments are not helpful. Those are very repulsive, actually. People are not usually argued into something. But the example speaks so much louder than our words. Another point that I get out of this is that we are also being called at a time of the small harvest. We are, each one of us, to be an example to others for this harvest period. And each of us have a part to play, to work in the field. That too is part of the book of Ruth, the story of the book of the Ruth. We each have to work in the field. Didn't Messiah say, the field is ready, the harvest is ripe and ready, but the workers are few? We don't have enough. Pray that the Lord of the Sabbath would send for more workers into the field to preach the good news, to share the way of Yeshua, to share the living Torah, to share the ways of God with the world. Even Ruth had to go into the field and work for her food. She had to work to receive the blessings. And each of us have a part to play. Our lives began much like Ruth's. A people who were void of the truth, a people who were living in sin and confusion, a people, though, who were ready to come out of the world and go to God's land and go to worship God and learn about God and become God's people and to associate and fellowship and love and bond with God's people, the house of Israel, to worship God. And just like Ruth, we are called to go wherever God leads us, wherever He leads us, to follow Him faithfully. Let's go back to the book of Ruth. Where did I leave off? Oh, let's see here. So, you know what? Before I go too much further into the book of the Ruth, I did want to share something with you. So I'm just going to sidetrack for a moment. Let's go back just for a moment to Exodus chapter 4. I just want to share a couple of other points here with you before I continue in the book of Ruth. I realize I'm not going to finish this message today, and that's okay. I'm going to finish it, God willing, on Shabbat. And I know that'll be after Shavuot, but it is what it is. And it's still a precious message that will be helpful, and it's close to Shavuot, and I think it'll be applicable. So we'll finish as much as we can today, and then we'll finish the balance, God willing, on Shabbat. So in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22, Exodus 4:22, God said, "You shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Eternal, Israel is my son. Israel is my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me." This is what Moses was instructed to tell the Pharaoh of Egypt. Israel is my son. Israel is my firstborn. In Jeremiah chapter 31, I just want to point out, Jeremiah was speaking as Israel was being exiled. As Judah was being exiled, Israel had already been exiled. Jeremiah 31, I believe, if I remember right, Israel had already been exiled. And it was already a done deal, and Jeremiah was explaining this, but this is what God said regarding Israel, even though they were going to go into the diaspora. They were going to be scattered for a while. Jeremiah 31 and verse 9 says, "They will come with weeping, and with supplications I will lead them, and I will cause them to walk by the rivers of water in a straight way in which they will not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations." In other words, all the world, all the nations of the world are listen. Hear what God says, Gentiles, and declare it in the islands that are far off. Listen up, Britain. All the islands would say, "He who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. For the Eternal has redeemed Jacob, and he has ransomed him from the hand of one stronger than he." They are God's firstborn. "Therefore they shall come and sing in the height of Zion, streaming to the goodness of the Eternal, for wheat, for new wine and oil, for the young of the flock and the herd. And their souls shall be like a well-watered garden, and they will sorrow no more at all." Now we too, in the congregation of God, we too, in the community of God, we too, in the church of God, are called to be God's special firstfruits. Whether you're a Jew or not, you are grafted in to be part of the firstfruits that this feast is to teach us about and to celebrate. In James 1, going into the New Testament, James chapter 1 and verse 18, it says, "Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of his creation." Again, the Apostle Saul said in the book of Romans chapter 8, Romans 8 and verse 23, says, "Not only they, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the sonship, the redemption of our body." So we have the Spirit of God. That means we are the first fruits of God. And that is what this feast is a time to celebrate. That's a beautiful thing. Like Ruth, we need to work in the field. Not just work for our own food. You see, one of the things that this teaches us, and this is important especially for my fellow Jews to learn, but I think also just equally as important for the household of God to learn, that is, everyone who is grafted in, everyone who has been made innocent and pure by the blood of the Lamb, all the Gentiles who are now grafted in to be part of Israel. You are part of Israel now. You are innocent, you are pure, and you are loved, and you're needed. We need you to work in the field. You see, one of the things the Pentecost festival of Shavuot teaches us, is that those who were called, Boaz was called the firstborn, the first fruits of God. And Boaz instructed all of his servants. If you think about Boaz as a type of the Messiah and all his servants as Israel, that's a very good analogy. It's a very good type. And Boaz instructed his men, go work in the field and lay extra sheaves, extra omers, extra grain, lay it aside. You know, when the statute of God says, when you go out into the field and you harvest, then you shall not harvest the corners of your field. You would leave a little bit in the corner so that the strangers, who are the strangers? The Gentiles walking through. Or just somebody who's walking through could be a fellow, Israelite too. But maybe it'd be a Gentile walking through, but a stranger, right? Strangers usually refers to the non-Israelites. But somebody coming through your land would have some grain, they could pick it and eat it. But it also says, as a statute of God, that you would leave some of the sheaves. The sheaves are like, well, okay, I already got this gathered up and put a little band on it. I tied a little band on it and kind of hooked it together, and then you lay it in a pile so you can't just, you get to the point where you can't carry everything. Just like a farmer, they go out with a combine and they gather their hay or the grain and they bundle it up into bales, and then it spits out a bale so it doesn't have to carry everything the whole way. And then they go get up enough for a bale and they let the bale sit there. And so then they would come by after they get all the sheaves, and they'd pick as much as they could carry, but they were instructed, leave a few sheaves, leave a few bundles of grain. So Ruth was allowed to gather grain and bundle it up herself. But she was also allowed to pick up any bundles that had fallen, because then they would get, just like today, they might get a trailer and pulled by a tractor, and they throw all the hay on top of the trailer. So back then they'd have a cart drawn by an ox or an ass, and they'd have on this cart, they would put all the sheaves on it, and they'd bring it into the storehouse so that they could win it and fan it and store it. And a sheaf would fall off here and there. And so then what Boaz instructed is, drop a little extra. Drop a little extra so that Ruth has something to get. Now, Ruth is a Gentile. So this is an instruction to the house of Israel to leave a little extra for those in need. Do a little something extra. Now, it was an agricultural society, and we're instructed to tithe on 3 times a year. All your males shall come and appear before the eternal your God. Once during the festival of Matzah, festival of unleavened bread. Once during the festival of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. That's today. And once at the gathering at the year's end for the Feast of Tabernacles, the festival of Sukkot. Well, guess what? Today, most people, they go to work and they earn a paycheck. Now, just consider, okay? God instructed them, leave a little behind for somebody else. Leave it in the field. Of course, on top of that, he had a tithing system. They were to give 10%. On top of that, they also were to give offerings. But they left a little in the field. When you get your paycheck, there's nothing left in the field. You earned, you did your work, and they have given you in full what you worked for. Nothing was left in the field. Now, I know Uncle Sam takes his off the top, and that's something we have no control over. But what we get is all of it. Nothing is left in the field. So, during Shavuot, this is your opportunity to take a little something and leave some sheaves behind for others. Because there are other Gentiles who need to come to the truth of Yeshua. There are other of our fellow Jews who need to come to the truth in Yeshua. Leave a little something for others. And so God instructs us to take up an offering on this day because it is a high day. It's one of those 3 days, and God says, none shall appear before me empty. It's very important. This is so that the work can continue. I ask for your support. If you value the messages you hear at Adonai, Church of God in peace and truth, I ask for your support. If you think somewhere else is the place to go, support them. But leave a little for those who follow. And the house of Israel was instructed to leave a little bit for Ruth. That's a type of what we are supposed to do to leave something for others so that they can come along, so that they can learn, so that they can benefit, and so that they can eat. Eat what? The spiritual meat. We are focused on serving spiritual food here. Now, I love and appreciate very much, the great works that people do and go out and feed the poor and have medical communities set up to help people with medical needs, and I think that's fantastic. Our ministry is primarily serving spiritual food. Would you leave a little in the field? Would you leave a little? Because your paycheck has left nothing in the field. This is our opportunity to leave a little something so that the Ruths who come back behind us will have what they need. That's how we all got here. And not only the Ruths, but also our fellow Jews who can learn the truth about Yeshua is Messiah. It's very precious. It's very, very important. It was a statute of God. Leviticus 23 and verse 22. I'll go just a little bit long today, but I know I'm going to finish this, God willing, on the next time. But Leviticus 23 and verse 22, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleanings from your harvest." In other words, when you gather your gleanings and you drop one, you don't go back into the field and say, "Oh, I dropped one over there," and get every last one. Leave a little something for others. It is a godly principle. It's part of keeping the high days. "You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the eternal your God. I am your provider." You can be poor physically. It doesn't change the fact that you need to learn how to give, just like the widow's mite, right? The widow still needed to give. But this is how the work of God continues. It always has been. It always has been. Save some energy for others. Give some food to others. Save some fruit for others. Give some meat for others. Save some of the gospel, some of the strength of the gospel for others. It's not just about our salvation. It's also about others. And Boaz was the field owner. Boaz was the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. It was a type of Messiah. Ruth was the bride of the first fruits harvest, a type of the congregation of God. And that's a very important lesson. Ruth was greatly helped. She still had to work. She was loved and rewarded for her work. But she did not produce her own fruit. Ruth did not produce her own fruit. It was given to her by the work of others. And in this case, by the house of Israel that is instructed to do work so that you can help Ruth, you can help the world, and take the good news to them as well. And all who are grafted into that tree that is Israel share in that common responsibility as a gift of God, that God uses the Levites to serve his people. And we are all called to become kings and priests. It's time for us to learn to act like it, begin to practice it now. The festival of first fruits, Shavuot, is a very precious time to begin to practice that. We'll go back to the book of Ruth then, and we'll kind of close it here, and we'll pick it up, God willing, next on the Shabbat, at the next time we meet together. I'll go back to Ruth. Okay. In verse 14 of Ruth chapter 2, verse 14, Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here and eat the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." She ate beside the reapers and passed parched grain to her, and she ate and she was satisfied, and she kept some back. She was keeping it back for Naomi so she could take it back to Naomi. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves. Give her plenty. And also let some of the grain fall from the bundles on purpose for her. Leave it that she may glean. Do not rebuke her." And so she gleaned in the field until evening. And she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up, and she went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and so she brought it out, and she gave it to her. She gave it to Naomi, and what she had kept back, she had been after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where have you gleaned today, and where did you work? Blessed be the one who has taken notice of you." And she took hold of her mother-in-law, with whom she had worked, and she said, "The man's name whom I worked with today is Boaz." There's a blessing upon those who work for others to share the bread of God with them. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be the Eternal, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." And Naomi said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our near kinsmen." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He said to me, 'You shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with the young men and the people, and that people do not meet you in any other field.' So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law, Naomi." And I think that finishes Ruth chapter 2. Then, God willing, we'll finish the book of Ruth on Shabbat and the rest of the meaning of this beautiful, beautiful day. It's too important to just let it skip by, but it's too much to give in one message. I suppose I should have maybe brought this a couple of days ago on last Shabbat, and then I could have finished it today, but such as it is. Anyway, Godspeed to all of you. Happy to share the day with you. We'll continue in a couple of days. Godspeed.